back. We're going to wrap up To Kill a Mockingbird today. So, one thing about this book, it is a Bill Dunn's Roman novel. The Bill Dunn's Roman novel is a novel with a moral and intellectual development of a youthful young character. Note that in the end of the book, Scout says, "As I made my way home, I thought Jim and I would get grown, but there wasn't much left for us to learn, except possibly algebra." Note, slight joke there about math, but the idea here is that they've learned a lot through these 2 years about what it means to live in Alabama and what society is about. So they learned that society is full of prejudice. The law doesn't guarantee justice for all. People are imperfect. People are cruel to each other. It doesn't necessarily mean that people are bad. Actually, people are really nice once you get to know them. But, again, there is segregation in the world that they live in. The law doesn't work for everybody. So let's talk about, in part one, there's a series of lessons, moral lessons that Scout learns that all contribute to this some of the themes. But let's talk about them or rehash them. You should probably look at the overview of part one. But lesson number one, talk about what other people are interested in. Note that this comes back in part two, particularly in chapters 15, when Scout talks to Mr. Cunningham about what he's interested in, which is really his kid, Walter, and he tried to talk about entailments. It actually saves Tom Robinson's life. Note that it also comes back in chapter 30 when she starts to talk to Boo Radley and try to talk about what Boo Radley might be interested in, which might be Jim. She even takes Boo in to see Jim one last time before he leaves. Lesson number two, anyone who sets foot in your house is your company. Note again, in part two, this happens in chapter 30 when Boo is in their house. She tries to take care of him. She leaves him out to sit in the rocking chair on the porch. Lesson three, you never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb in their skin and walk around in it. This reappears throughout the book. It is first brought up in chapter 3 with Atticus trying to get Scout to think about put herself in Mrs. Caroline's shoes for a minute. But then it reappears in chapter 16 when Atticus talks about how Scout allowed Mr. Cunningham to stand in Atticus's shoes for a minute. And then it also happens in chapter 23 when Atticus talks about trying to stand in Bob's shoes for a moment. And then also in chapter 31 when Scout says, Atticus was right. One time he said, you never really know a man until you stand in his shoes and walk around in them. Just standing on the Radley porch was enough. Very important theme, probably the most important, very important lesson, probably the most important lesson as it ties into prejudice. How do you deal with prejudice? Well, you try to stand in someone else's position for a moment. You need to learn how to compromise. Lesson 4. Lesson 5. Let people live the way they want to, and make sure you're invited before you invade someone else's property. Note that this appears throughout the book with Mr. Raymond, Dolphus Raymond, Miss Maudie, Boo Radley. So it's very important. Another important lesson that also reinforces the theme of prejudice. Let other people live how they want to live. Doesn't matter if they are doing something that's perhaps different than you. Let them live how they live or want to live. Also note that this goes into the Runyas, this group in Africa that are trying. The missionary society is trying to save for some reason. Keep a positive outlook on things. Note that Atticus and Maudie have positive outlooks throughout the novel. Maudie, even after the verdict is made, Tom Robinson is guilty or convicted. Miss Maudie says that, only a man like Atticus could keep a jury out for so long, and says that they're making progress, though it's, you know, small progress. It's at least progress. Um, Lesson number 7, don't use language or violence unless you have extreme proclamation, unless you're extremely provoked. Note that Scout fights less and less in part 2. Part 1, she fights at least 4 boys. In part 2, she fights Jim. But by the time we get to the court scenes, she's fighting a lot less. And she's quit using language. Note, the extreme provocation really comes in with, like, Boo saving the kids' lives. Always listen to both sides of an argument. Lesson 8. This comes very important to the court case. Note that Tom Robinson is convicted before the court case even starts, before you even get Tom Robinson's testimony. He's been proven guilty. Note this also happens in chapter 30 with the argument between Atticus and Hecate. Hecate is actually right in this moment, and Scout, after listening to both sides, tells Atticus that he's right. If he's sort of like shooting a Mockingbird to make Boo a hero and bring him out into the limelight and have everyone celebrate him because of his shy ways. They would destroy him. Lesson number 9: people in the right minds never take pride in their talents. Lesson number 10: the way we conduct ourselves when the chips are down is what really matters. Think about how Atticus, Jim, Scout, Mr. Link Diaz conduct themselves, particularly after the trial. They continue to hold themselves to high standards. Mr. Link Diaz goes so far, to stand up to Bob Ewell and to protect Helen Robinson. 11. Before you can live with other folks, you first have to live with yourself and your own conscience. Note that change never happens if you don't listen to your inner voice. Atticus, if he listens to everyone else and not himself, doesn't take this court case, and nothing ever changes. Lesson number 12: it's never to be an insult to be called what someone else thinks is a bad name. Lesson 13: courage is when you know you're licked before you begin, but begin anyway and see it through no matter what. You rarely win, but sometimes you do. Note that in this book, we do have, Mrs. DeBose winning because she licked this habit of drug morphine. But you also have Tom Robinson and Atticus winning. They see this thing through to the end. And while they have no chance of winning, they do invoke change. Evoke change. Change is happening. Slowly, but it's happening. But it would never have happened if they didn't start and stand up to the system. So let's look at change in the book and the people of change. Note that the Cunninghams change. The Cunninghams are going to lynch Tom Robinson in chapter 15. But by the time you get to the court case, because of how Scout had made Mr. Cunningham think about Atticus's point of view and put himself in Atticus' shoes, they have changed so much so that they don't want to convict Tom Robinson. It takes a little bit of wearing down for the Cunningham on that jury to vote guilty. Cecil Jacobs changes. You note he's calling Atticus a nigger lover in chapter 9, but by the end of the book, he is asking if Atticus is a radical. There's a change in tone there and a change in respect. You have Mr. Link Diaz. Yes, he is the employer of Tom Robinson, but he goes so far to actually stand up to Bob Ewell and to protect Helen Robinson at the end of his novel. He has sort of changed how he reacts to things. You have Mr. Braxton Braggs Underwood. Note that Atticus says that Mr. Underwood despises Negroes, but he writes an article condemning the town in secret, and saying that in the secret hearts of men, Tom Robinson was guilty as soon as May Ella opened her mouth. Note he's sort of now speaking out against the system of racism that is present. You have Alexandria becoming more and more open. And you have the town in a whole They convict Tom Robinson, but afterwards they condemn Bob Ewell. They condemn Bob Ewell for lying and for forcing them to convict Tom. I mean, they can't not, they, the way the town works, the way racism works, they can't, they have to, at least in their belief, convict Tom because a white woman had said a statement about Tom, about a black person. The change and progress is slow, but it starts with one person standing up against injustice. Also, note that after every civil war, there is a process of healing that takes place, and the community eventually comes back together as one. Perhaps, they're going to come back together as one, eventually, both white and black. All right, so let's talk about some symbolism. There are a lot of symbols in this book. If you had to write an essay, I would say that there's some things to look at are flowers. There's a lot of different flowers here, and they're all symbolic. Think about May Ella's flowers. Think about Miss DeBose's flowers. Think about Miss Maudie's flowers. Think about Calpurnia. You also have birds. You have blue jays, mockingbirds, sunflower birds, finches, whippoorwills, bobwhites, probably more, but those are some that you can think about. Trees, you have at least oak and the Chinaberry tree. But some three big ones that you need to know. The mad dog, racism, how people react when confronted with issues of race, as if they've lost their mind. So racism. Think about the different scenes that this appears in. There's a big, the video about the Tom Robinson being convicted. There's a big section there about the mad dog and how it appears in the court. The knothole, communication. This is how Boo is trying to communicate to the kids. Go back through the videos about on the chapter about the knothole and listen to it. You go through everything that's actually in that knothole. You also have mockingbirds. Mockingbirds don't do anything but make music for people to enjoy. Kind of what Miss Maudie says. Note that there are two real mockingbirds in this book, Tom Robinson and Boo Radley. Think about what they do. Tom Robinson helps May Ella because no one else in her family helps her. No one else in the community is helping her. So he feels sorry for her. She has no help, and so he helps her every day on his way home from work. Boo Radley. What does Boo Radley do? Well, he takes care of his neighbors, these children, Boo, Jim and Scout, in multiple times. Not just saving their lives at the end, which is a big one, but he gives them gifts. He puts a blanket around Scout when it's cold out. He stitches Jim's pants together and leaves them for him to find. He protects them multiple times. Okay, so there's a ton of allusions in this book. There's allusions to Andrew Jackson, who was a slave owner, a slave trader, and famous for being an Indian hater. You have allusions to the Missouri Compromise, which ironically is a compromise. There's that big lesson about compromise. It's the first time that the North and South compromise about the issue of slavery by trying to balance the free states and the slave states, to balance the power by number. You also have many allusions to the Civil War. You have allusions to Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, General Hood, Braxton Bragg. Those are all Confederate generals. Adamatic Courthouse, the last when Lee surrenders this Army of Northern Virginia to General Grant. You have Arlington. You have Dixie. These are all reinforce the idea of prejudice or separation, unequal separation that still exists in the South based on race. So this second wave of a type of making African Americans secondhand citizens. They also reinforce the idea that Macon was just fought a civil war in this court case, and hopefully there will be some sort of reconstruction and healing that goes on after the war. And we've already seen that there is some, and the town is healing and coming back together. So plot. So a traditional plot structure, if you look at the first 8 chapters, the exposition is chapters 1 through 8. And a lot of it is about the story about Boo Radley, or making Boo come out. The inciting event, the beginning of the Rise in Action, happens in chapter 9, the very beginning, with Cecil Jacobs. And then you have the Rise in Actions in chapters 9 through 21. The climax is when Tom is convicted. Fall in Action is, up until chapter 30, 29, 30. And the resolution is Bob Buell is killed. Boo comes out. Scout walks him home, and we learn how Jim has broken his arm, which is what starts at the beginning of the chapter. Do note that a good novel, a good piece of art, begins and ends at the same place. So not only do you have Jim breaking his arm, and we learn, at the end, and that's how the story starts. Let me just read you that real quick. But we have Andrew Jackson appearing in these final chapters too. When he was nearly 13, my brother Jim got his arm badly broke at the elbow. When it healed, and Jim's fears of never being able to play football were surged, he was seldom self-conscious about his injury. His left arm was somewhat shorter than his right when he stood or walked. The back of his hand was at right angles to his body's, his thumb parallel to his thigh. He couldn't have cared less, so long as he could pass and punt. When enough years had gone by to enable us to look back on them, we sometimes discuss the events leading to his accident. I maintain that the Yule started all, but Jim, who is 4 years my senior, said it started long before that. He said it began the summer Dill came to us, when Dill first gave us the idea of making Boo Radley come out. I said, if you want to take a broad view of the thing, it really began when Andrew Jackson. If General Jackson hadn't run the creeks up the creek, Simon Finch would have never paddled up the Alabama, and where would we have been if he hadn't? So that's the opening note that comes to full conclusion at the end, comes in full circle at the end. I also talked about how you can look at this book as a 3-part structure. Part 1 would be chapters 1 through 11, mostly about making Boo come out. Part 2 would be chapters 12 through 21, mostly about the lead up to the court case and the court case. And part 3 would be chapters 22 through 31, sort of the aftermath of the court case, and how we get the tie in with the court case and Boo Radley, or Bob Buell and Boo Radley. I also talked about how this was an episodic plot. Note that there are less episodes in part 2 than there are in part 1, but here's some episodes to think about. You have going to Calpurnia's church. You have the mob scene outside the jail. You have the courtroom case. And then you have the Halloween carnival and the aftermath. There are a few chapters, really short chapters, that seem to tie the court case to the ending. These are really chapters 23 through 27. So maybe 4 or 5 episodes in part 2. All right, so that is about everything that you need to know. You need to know characters too. I'm not going to go through all of the characters, but you need to know the characters. So look back through all the book and list all the characters that you can. There's a bunch of them. They're all important in their own ways, and I've mentioned and talked about all of them throughout these videos. But also the themes. Some major themes that we have talked about in this book are the nature of prejudice, and it's not just racism, but prejudice against old people, prejudice against young people, prejudice against girls, prejudice against those who are different. Think about all the different types of prejudice that exist, that show up, and be able to list some scenes that reinforce those. The meaning of duty, another important theme that we've talked deeply about. Appearance versus reality. Note that the ending quote, most people are actually really nice once you get to know them. It sort of reinforces that. And to a lesser extent, the meaning of courage. Okay, that's it for this video. I hope that helps. Email me, text me if you have some questions.